presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the IES website. If at any time during this webinar you experience difficulty with the webinar software or your audio connection, please call John Wynn at 714-826-9600. He is available during this presentation to assist you with any technical difficulties you may have. We have shared his information in the confirmation email you received, and we will now share it in the chat section of your screen. To locate the chat feature, please go to the control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If the control panel is minimized, you will see a small red rectangle in which there is an arrow pointing left. Press that arrow to open the control panel and locate and press the arrow and plus button sign next to the word chat. Once the chat function in the control panel is open, you will see John's contact information in the box below the word chat. Again, you need to open the control panel and locate and press the arrow or plus sign next to the word chat in order to see John's contact information in the box below the word chat. At any point during this presentation, you can ask the presenters questions. We will share your questions with the panelists during the question and answer periods. To send us your questions, please go to the control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and then locate and press the arrow or plus sign next to the word question. Type in the box under the word questions and hit send. Notice that the box for questions is different than the box for chat. Please use the questions box to send us questions for the presenters and the chat box to find John's contact information. Please notice that you have a chat box in which you can send us comments or comments to the participants. At this point, I would like to hand the webinar over to Dr. Joy Lesnick, Acting Associate Commissioner at NCEERA, who will be introducing our presenters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, where we're excited to give you an overview of the newest What Works Clearinghouse practice guide entitled Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners in Elementary and Middle School. Before I turn it over to the panelists to talk about the recommendations in this practice guide, I want to give you just a brief overview of the What Works Clearinghouse and some of our other products and resources. Next. In a nutshell, what we do at the WWC is review the research on different programs, products, practices, and policies in education. And then by focusing on the results from high-quality research, we try to answer the question, what works in education? And the goal is to provide you with some of the information you'll need to make evidence-based decisions. The WWC website is where you can find all of our resources, and this slide shows just a screenshot of the home page. On the bottom half of the left side of the bottom half of the screen is where you can see our main products. The practice guides, which we're going to talk more about today, intervention reports, which summarize all of the effectiveness research on a given program, single study reviews, which provide information about individual studies that meet What Works Clearinghouse standards, and quick reviews, which are an email news blast of information about a study that has received significant media attention. We also have a searchable database of all of the studies that have been reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse, which at last count is just over 10,000 studies. And you can access that all on our website, all for free. You can also browse for products related specifically to English learners by choosing the Topics in Education tab at the top of the screen just under the Institute of Education Sciences logo, and selecting English learners or another topic you're interested in. So after today's presentation, I encourage you to visit the website to become more familiar with the additional resources. And these slides will also be posted on this website after this presentation. Next. So practice guides are one of the What Works Clearinghouse's most downloaded products, and this slide just gives you a sense of the other practice guides that are available on a variety of topic areas. So for example, we have a guide on turning around low-performing schools, on reducing behavior problems in elementary schools, response to intervention both in reading and math, teaching reading comprehension, mathematical problem solving, teaching fractions, and other topics. So I encourage you to take a look. Next. But the focus of today's presentation is on our newest practice guide for teaching English learners. And so you may be familiar with our 2007 practice guide on this topic, and this guide is the first time that the What Works Clearinghouse has updated a practice guide, so we're very excited to share it with you today. In the introduction of this guide, there's an extensive explanation about how this guide is different from the 2007 guide as a result of the expanding amount of research evidence available on this topic. So this practice guide is both a continuation and expansion of that original guide, which still stands alone. It expands the research base from kindergarten through 5th grade to kindergarten through 8th grade and builds on that previous research while including new recommendations, which the panelists will talk in detail about today. Next. So when the What Works Clearinghouse develops a practice guide, we put together a panel of both researchers and expert practitioners to contribute to the guide in order to have the recommendations and suggestions be most useful to practitioners. And so in the next slide, I'll give you a list of just the panelists who participated in creating this guide. So before I turn it over to the presenters to talk about the 4 recommendations, I'd like to point out the level of evidence for each of the recommendations listed in the guide. And there are appendices and explanations about how all of these ratings are determined and all of the studies that exist that support each rating. So if you're interested in that information, please see the guide itself. I'll just take one moment to tell you that the level of evidence always relates to how much existing research there is in a particular area. All of the recommendations are supported by the expert panel, and some have more evidence than others for a variety of reasons that are described more completely in the guide. Next. So I'd like to thank the 3 panelists who are going to be talking with us today about the recommendations in detail: Scott Baker, our panel chair, Nani Lasso, and Patrick Proctor. And at this point, I'll now turn it over to Nani Lasso.
Hi, thank you. This is Nani Lasso, and I'll be speaking today about recommendation 1. Next. So the first recommendation that we landed upon for this new guide, which is driven by a strong level of evidence, is that we need to teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively and across several days using a variety of instructional activities. And I'll unpack that, what we mean now. Next. So what we mean by that is really focuses on going deep on academic words. And like I said, the level of evidence for this recommendation is strong. It was based on 6 studies that met What Works Clearinghouse standards, 5 of which used randomized controlled trials to examine the effects of the intervention, and 1 used a quasi-experimental design. We as a panel consider the application of the findings that go into these studies for pre-K to 8 settings, and therefore think about academic vocabulary teaching across the elementary years. One of the studies was conducted in the primary grades. The other 5 were in the upper elementary and middle school years. What I should add is that these studies were conducted in integrated settings involving both English learners and native English speakers, though, as you can imagine, in most of those settings, the majority of the classroom students were English learners. Next. When we think about what the evidence means for teaching, we think about it in 2 ways. 1, we identified 4 instructional elements, but the elements alone don't tell us how to do this in practice. So what we've identified for the purposes of the guide is both the 4 elements and how we do this in classrooms. So I'm going to spend some time today talking with you about these 4 elements and how we think about the how-tos. The first element is text selection and use. So you can see that our recommendation focuses on choosing a brief, engaging piece of informational text that includes academic vocabulary and using that as a platform for intensive vocabulary instruction. The second instructional element relates to which words we choose to teach. So word selection is a common question. It's a common issue. It's not a small issue because there are many words we can teach. So here we're looking for choosing a small set of academic vocabulary words for in-depth instruction. The third element relates to word learning activities, which I'll say more, which is what does it actually look like when students are learning words? What do the tasks look like? And here we're really focused on using multiple modalities: writing, speaking, and listening. And finally, the fourth element that I'll talk more about relates to word learning strategy instruction. So the how-to is that students in classrooms need to be able to independently figure out the meaning of words, not just be taught words themselves. So here we focus on the kinds of strategies that help our students become more independent word learners. Next. So why don't I spend some time on each of these 4 elements. The first, again, step 1, focuses on choosing a brief, engaging piece of informational text that includes academic vocabulary and using it as a platform for intensive academic vocabulary instruction. So you'll see on this slide and in the guide that we provide an example of a short piece of informational text. In this case, it focuses on the ethical treatment of animals as it relates to keeping them in zoos. You'll see around the edges of the text example, we have 4 elements that we think about when we think about text selection. So the first is that the text contains ideas that can be discussed from a variety of perspectives. So in this particular sample text, we talk about zoos today versus zoos of the past, the different kinds of reconstructed habitats that we might see in zoos depending on the species. So the first is that there are a number of ideas that can be discussed from a variety of perspectives, in part because we want to keep returning to this text in order to support the deep word learning that we're looking for. If there aren't big ideas in the text, then we can't use it over time. Not surprisingly, we're looking for text with a variety of target academic words. In this case, words like environment, impact, and investigation are very good, solid academic words to teach. They cut across the content areas, and they support comprehension using a number of texts. The other element that we're focused on is that it tends to be that we're looking for the text to connect to a unit of study and build knowledge. So in this case, this text relates very nicely to a unit of study on the ethical treatment of animals. So we don't have this text sit independently of a unit of study, but we connect it to the unit of study, and therefore our academic words are part of that unit of study. And finally, we notice, not surprisingly, that the texts that we're choosing provide details and examples to support comprehension. But again, we're using the text primarily here as a platform for intensive academic vocabulary instruction, which is different from choosing text strictly to teach comprehension. Next. The second step, focuses on choosing a small set of academic vocabulary words for in-depth instruction. This is in many ways a shift from a lot of traditional practice around vocabulary, where we're looking to get through many more words. We're worried about how many words our students are learning, and therefore we are often starting with a list and covering that list over time, maybe Monday to Friday with spelling. Here, what we're talking about is a fundamentally different approach, which is that we start with a text, we identify this small set of academic vocabulary words, and we study them in depth. So when we choose the words, we notice that they are frequently used in the text right off the bat. They are central to understanding the text, in this case, exhibit, impact, and pursuit. They appear in other content areas. They have affixes, which allows us, in this case, to work on word learning strategies as well as just study the words themselves. They often have multiple meanings and uses. That's a key feature of academic words. And they have cross-language potential for study. So reminding ourselves that we're focused on supporting English learners' language development, many of whom bring another language, obviously, to the equation, and therefore we look to tap their cross-linguistic features. Once we've selected those words, we worry then about ensuring we have many modalities to teach them by. Next. So our third step focuses on the kinds of activities and the kinds of modalities that we use to do that teaching. Next. You'll see here that we're focused on the way in which we can build up vocabulary using reading, speaking, and listening-based activities. So we think about the notion of having oral and written language development in our classrooms. In that sense, we move past just the spoken activities or even the reading activities and get into the activities that involve writing and listening. So here we ask that we require students to use the target academic words in their writing. We engage them in activities that will increase their exposure to and experiences with target words across the day, across several days, and across different activities. We explicitly teach words using student-friendly definitions, examples, and concrete representations. We facilitate structured discussions in which students use and talk about the words, and we ensure that they just generally have many opportunities to practice differences in usage and meaning. So with multiple modalities comes multiple opportunities for word learning, and we remind ourselves that this happens over time. Next, I'll provide some examples of what this might look like. So you'll see that we call out, in this case, we call out 3 different ways to use these multiple modalities. The first might be to have students generate their own student-friendly definition, or to generate that and have them start from there. So in this case, pursuit, trying your best to get something or be somebody, or stuff you do. Much of the good vocabulary, effective vocabulary instruction to build up academic vocabulary has students, as I mentioned, interacting. So in the case of a role play, which we play out in the guide and provide examples in more detail, in this case, one student might be interviewing another, saying, in your opinion, what options should be pursued in designing an exhibit for SEALs? And you'll see that the target word, exhibit, and the academic word, opinion, is in this question. So there we have students in the role of listener and speaker, drawing on their content knowledge and probably making links back to the anchor text. Finally, you'll see in the guide that we recommend extended writing projects to consolidate and provide written opportunities for students to develop their academic vocabulary. So here, in a end-of-unit closing writing project, we'd have a prompt that might say, decide what kind of zoo you think would be better to visit and write a paragraph that explains your choice. Make sure to compare the new exhibits with the old exhibits. So in that sense, it's a consolidation kind of capstone activity that forces students to use the words and the academic words and practice their written language. Our 4th step and final one next relates to the word learning strategies that we want students to gain in order to independently figure out the meaning of words. So just as a reminder for all of us who work with English learners and think a lot about their language learning needs, we cannot possibly teach them or their English-only peers all of the words that they need to know. But we could, in fact, teach them to be better word learners independently. So one of the steps that we recommend, the 4th and final step in the guide for teaching academic words, involves examples of the kinds of learning tasks that help students understand and analyze words that they come across that they are unfamiliar with. So here, as examples, we push on context clues. We provide examples of teaching that involves morphology, so analyzing the parts of words. And we also, of course, go to cognates to both support our English learners and help them recognize differences and similarities across languages. Next. We wrap up this recommendation with 2 roadblocks and some potential solutions, and I'd also, of course, be happy to take questions at the end of this webinar. The first roadblock we call out is this notion of selecting text that might not be an option outside of the district-mandated curriculum. So when districts have, very strict guidelines around text, here we remind our audience that certainly the existing texts are the ones that we should and can use to do this. So we're happy to put existing resources to use toward building academic vocabulary knowledge. So there may be a passage in a science textbook that we haven't historically used for academic vocabulary teaching, but that may be a very good fit, and then also be a nice fit with other instruction that we're doing that's content-based. At the same time, we always recommend some of the complex texts that are publicly available, and even thinking about short pieces like newspaper articles and op-eds that may not be central to the scope and sequence and to the day's lesson, but may also be platforms for studying words that connect to the content under study. The second roadblock we call out gets back to this pervasive issue of time. And so if we're going to make this shift to teaching words deeply, there's an issue of planning time to do this, to plan this kind of instruction. The solution that we're suggesting is really around professional collaboration. There's a lot of room to do this work very well in educator teams with common planning times who may in fact be cross-content areas. Some of the most powerful vocabulary teaching actually shares the words under study across classrooms and content areas. So if we harken back here to our academic words that were being taught as part of our sample lesson, exhibit, environment, impact, those are words that cut across content areas and could be studied in that way across classrooms. Next, I'm going to introduce and turn it over to my colleague Patrick Proctor from Boston College, who's going to talk about recommendation number 2.
Okay, thank you, Noni. I'm going to talk about recommendation 2 and 3. As you'll see, I'll spend more time talking about recommendation 2, given its level of evidence, and somewhat less time on recommendation 3. So recommendation 2 is to integrate oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. And here we see a strong level of evidence. Next. And supporting that strength are 5 randomized controlled trials, all showing positive impact on content area acquisition across a range of grade levels spanning from pre-K all the way through the intermediate and middle school levels. And as Noni mentioned with the vocabulary work, these classrooms contain both English learners and native English speakers, which speaks to some degree of generalizability for the heterogeneous classrooms that many teachers find themselves teaching. Next. So the instructional elements here in the associated how-tos, again, there are 4. The first is to work with English learners to make sense of content, and in doing so, strategically use instructional tools, videos, visuals, graphic organizers that anchor instruction and help students make sense of content in a way that minimizes the linguistic demands but maximizes the conceptual development. Academic vocabulary, something Noni has just finished speaking well to, explicitly teaching content-specific academic vocabulary. Importantly, particularly for my talk today, is the use of pairs or small group discussions, either having students talk to each other or independently or with teacher facilitation. We see often in classrooms a whole lot of teacher talk and not so much student talk. And what we really want to push on with this recommendation is the need for kids to use expressive language as a means by which to develop their own English. Receptive language is important, expressive language is also important, and we want to push on instruction that really leverages expressive language opportunities for kids. And along those lines, providing writing opportunities to extend student learning is something I'll talk about in more detail when we get to recommendation 3. Next. So I'm going to focus on steps 1 and 2 that I've already introduced in the following instructional example. Next. So I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Concha. She is a 6th grade sheltered English science teacher. And she wants her students, who are a group of English learners from beginning to intermediate level English proficiency, wants her students to be able to identify and articulate relevant evidence about a specific claim, a rather syntactically complex claim, that antibiotics cure infection by killing all types of bacteria in the body including the harmful bacteria that cause infection. So that's quite a mouthful for kids who are beginning to learn English, or who are at a sort of a moderate level of English proficiency. So the teacher wants to make this claim accessible to the students and to provide them with cognitive resources to develop an understanding of that claim. She's using this claim in conjunction with a short text, much like the one Noni described with respect to the zoo example. And she's going to teach just 3 words to do this activity. The first word is relevant, which doesn't relate to the text but relates to the activity, and then antibiotic and bacteria. And so what she does in having taught these 2 words, she then works with the students to reduce the claim into a linguistically more simple claim: antibiotics kill bacteria. The students know what kill means. They've worked with antibiotics and bacteria, so now they've got an understanding, a basic understanding of the concept here. Next. So here's what Ms. Concha does with her students. She provides them with a series of cards labeled A through G, so 7 cards, containing information that either supports or does not support the claim that antibiotics kill bacteria. That is, she asks them, is the information on these cards relevant to the claim or not, yes or no, and asks the kids to go about the task of sorting the cards into relevant or irrelevant information. And I'm going to show you these cards, and we're going to try a little poll to sort of mimic what Ms. Concha is trying to do. So here are the 4 cards. Here are the first 4 cards. And the students are working together to sort through what's relevant and what's not relevant. So what I'd like you to do is take just a couple minutes, or a few seconds is more accurate, and read through these 4 claims to determine on your own, or with colleagues if you're with them, which single card provides information that is relevant to supporting the claim that antibiotics kill bacteria. So we'll take 10 seconds just to read through these. And now we're going to start a poll. Start the poll. Okay, so what you should do is select which single card provides information that's relevant to supporting the claim, and then click Submit. Okay, let's close the poll. I see that 88% of people selected A. Okay, good. Next. And the correct answer, according to Ms. Concha, was in fact A. Next. The argument being here that in card A, you can very clearly see the claim represented in the sentence. That is, antibiotics are medicine that kill bacteria. So this first treatment is rather simple. It's just asking kids to go back and take and really find the claim embedded within a larger segment of text. But she doesn't stop there. Next. Now she wants to build the conceptual understanding around this. And so she presents the kids with 3 more cards and asks them, again, which of these cards, in this case there are 2, provide information that's relevant to supporting the claim that antibiotics kill bacteria. So we're going to do the same thing. Take about 10 or 15 seconds, take a look at these 3 cards, and try to come to a conclusion as to which 2 you think support that claim. Okay, let's start the poll. So select one of those sets of 2 and click Submit. And let's close the poll. And 90% say F and G. Very good. Next. The answer is F and G. Next. So in this one, you see it's moving away from text and getting much more into concept. So you can see in card F, you have the key vocabulary in the form of labels, and then the student has to work to understand that, well, it's likely that the reason those bacteria are not around the antibiotic disc is because the antibiotic disc is perhaps killing them. And then in card G, again, you have a similar kind of phenomenon, a pie chart in chart 2 that speaks to bacteria, and then a pie chart in chart 3 that speaks to reduced bacteria after antibiotics. So with a relatively simple or reduced linguistic framework, students can use these visual images and to really dig into the conceptual understandings that undergird the claim. Next. So, and that leads to step 3. How did Ms. Concha carry this out in her class? She obviously wasn't polling her students on the internet. Next. So she had her students, she paired her students and had them work with all 7 cards, actively sorting them into piles of relevant and irrelevant. And I'm going to focus on one example of 2 students who were working together, Sophia and Ava. Both are native Spanish speakers. Ava possesses higher English language proficiency relative to Sophia, who's a relatively recently arrived immigrant. And here's a brief excerpt of their conversation as they worked through this activity. Next. So here's the brief conversation. Sophia, the less English proficient one, starts speaking in Spanish. Irá está acá. Does this one go here? And she places a card in the pile. And then Ava steps in and straightforwardly reads the claim, or reads the information on the card. And at the very end of her having rereading it, and we know that rereading through the research on comprehension supports understanding, Sophia chimes in, finishes reading with her, and says in turn 3, I think this here, pointing to the irrelevant pile, because doesn't support the claim. So you see Sophia making use of the academic vocabulary that is claim in discussing the activity. But Ava pushes her. She says, why? Sophia says, because dice, it says, and she reads again. And then you can see she's breaking down. She says, I think yo no puedo hacer bien la cosa esta. I can't do this thing. She's expressing frustration, but through Spanish. And then Ava steps in this final point of support. Okay, I think here is your information, because they are like no connecting in the claim because they don't have any antibiotics and kills and bacteria, like B, right? And here they have, we have to see and read if they are antibiotics killing bacteria. And here this say antibiotics kill bacteria. That's why it's here. So you can see Ava understanding very clearly the language demands of the task and how to attack the information that's being presented in the cards, but also supporting her partner who is less certain about the activity, and linking through the common understanding of Spanish through their discussion. Next. So a summary of this approach, how to, 1, approaches that help make sense of context. This card sort activity, it's grounded in text, provides linguistic and visual information for students to consider in relation to the task. It also allows the students to physically engage with words, sentences, visuals, and ideas. Explicit vocabulary instruction, Ms. Concha has targeted key vocabulary. She's reduced linguistic complexity, but allowed for the cognitively complex exploration of content here. And finally, she's given her students opportunities to talk with each other, and she's doing this by being very strategic in her grouping. She's grouping heterogeneously by English language proficiency, but homogeneously by native language. And that paired work allows for the language of discussion to vary. And that's important, that when students are working in groups, if they're paired along dimensions of a common native language, the discussion, the way they make sense of content, ought to be able to vary. That is, the language of the discussion ought to be able to vary. the expression of understanding that might take in the form of writing or whole group presentation ought to take place in English. But the cognitive organization and the coming to understanding, that in those contexts, the language can most certainly be allowed to vary so that kids have the most access to that content. Next. So some roadblocks and solutions to this recommendation. We hear this a lot, that teachers who specialize in the content area often say they lack the language and literacy expertise that will allow them to provide these kinds of supports. A response that the panel has to that kind of a concern, which is a valid concern, but in the case of this particular recommendation, what the real struggle with is in getting kids to talk and have their voices be more a part of instruction, that is not so much a specialized language and literacy issue. Rather, that's an instructional issue that all of us as teachers struggle with. That is, how do we let go of control of the floor and cede some of it to students so that they have the opportunities to practice. And that's something that spans across the content area. And those opportunities for language use are what's at the core of this recommendation. And finally, teachers think that the additional focus, may think that the additional focus on language won't be so useful for native English speakers, but part of the strength of this recommendation is that it's coming from studies in which both native English and English learners were grouped together in the same classrooms. So the findings suggest that these are beneficial approaches for both groups of students, and also align quite cleanly with several dimensions of the Common Core. Next. So now I'm going to move on to recommendation 3, and you'll see here, provide regular structured opportunities to develop written language skills. Here we have a minimal level of evidence. Next. So as some background, when the panel, the first meeting of the panel, we went around and discussed the 2007 guide, what we liked, what we thought was there, what we thought wasn't there. And one thing that came up sort of universally amongst the group was a lack of a focus on writing in the first guide. And the very appropriate response to that was there was simply no research to report on at the time that guide was produced on writing in English learners. And since then, only 2 studies have met What Works Clearinghouse standards, and they weren't focused directly on writing interventions. One was a professional development with teachers, and student writing is somewhat as a distal outcome of that professional development. And the other was a complex vocabulary intervention conducted by Dr. Lasso, where writing was one outcome, but it was not an intervention designed directly to affect writing outcomes. So there's not a lot of evidence, but we know that kids need to write. We know that that's a huge demand of schooling. It's a major form of expressive language. And there's a broad research consensus, as I've said before, that students get lots of chances to hear language, but far fewer opportunities to use it productively. And in this sense, we ground writing instruction and writing as expressive language, as productive language for students acquiring English. Next. So I'm going to. So we have again 4 elements here. One is to be writing assignments across the content area that are anchored in content and focused on developing academic language and writing skills. Providing language-based supports for writing that facilitate students' entry into and development of writing. Harkening back to recommendation 2, working in pairs and small groups around writing to discuss, to pre-write, to edit together, and to work on varied aspects of writing. And finally, to use writing as an assessment tool, not just as a summative assessment, that is as a final product, for example, in a writer's workshop model, but also small bits of writing that can be used formatively and assessed formatively along dimensions of language, content knowledge, and things of that nature. Next. So what I'd because this is such a wide open recommendation, I think this recommendation falls into the hands of teachers and is open to a great deal of exploration. The panel is recommending that writings take place regularly in classrooms. But I'd ask you to think back to the Ms. Concha example, and providing writing assignments that are anchored in content, what might a writing assignment following up that activity look like? One might be that Sophia and Ava have to write a reasoned response as to why they sorted cars into the relevant pile. But another might be that this is taking place in a larger unit of study that's culminating with a more extended essay on the development of the use of antibiotics in the medical profession. And this was sort of an introductory activity. So this bit of knowledge might be used in a larger writing project down the line. Step 2 for writing assignments, language-based supports. This is something that we do see quite a bit of, or at least I do see in my work with teachers. In general ed classrooms that have lots of English language learners, that is the use of graphic organizers, sentence starters, common across many elementary and middle school classrooms. Teaching directly to vocabulary and syntactic demands, which vary. Syntax very often varies as a function of the content that's under study. And those language-based supports can be considered that as approaches that help leverage the next step, which is using pairs and small groups to provide opportunities for students to work and talk together, which Ms. Concha's activity does exactly that. If we move that example forward, those students, Sophia and Ava, would be able to write more based on the discussions that they've had together. And finally, that writing could be used by the teacher, depending on how she wanted to formatively assess the degree of comprehension that they have. She could assess the degree of their understanding of what relevant means. She could look at it from any number of the linguistic dimensions that Noni mentioned, whether it be morphological or semantic understandings of words and their use in the content area. Next. And finally, roadblocks and solutions. Teachers may be concerned with the limited amount of writing that many English learners produce when they're given an extended writing project. And that can be true, but ironically, that is what often causes many of us to stop using writing in the classroom, because it seems like we're getting so little in return on the investment. But it's time on task that will yield increasing return on the investment, but it does take time. Though interestingly, for emergent English learners, writing can often be the first entree into literacy, even before reading comprehension comes along. Because if you think about it, you have control over what you write, so that you're not as constrained by language in the same way. If you can think it and say it, you can write it down. But if someone else has thought it and written it down in a very specific way that you're not able to understand, then reading becomes a far more demanding emergent literacy opportunity than writing does. And finally, designing and implementing effective peer collaborative activities can be difficult, and this is true. If we think back on what Ms. Concha did, she experiments a lot with different grouping strategies to see what works and what does not. Grouping homogenously by language, heterogeneous by language proficiency is one approach. She might reverse that approach. But being flexible in using those peer collaborations is important, even if you abandon them for some students who don't like to do that but work better independently. But the important point with writing instruction is understanding what serves students best. Next. And at this point, I think we're ready to take questions.
Thank you, Noni and Patrick. At this time, we will be asking Noni and Patrick the questions you send in. To send us a question, please go to the control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If the control panel is minimized, you will see a small red rectangle in which there is an arrow pointing left. Press that arrow to open the control panel, and then locate and press the arrow or plus sign next to the word question. Type in the box under the word questions and then send the question. Noni, we already have a couple questions for you. how many words are included in a small set, and over what time period should they be teaching those?
Thanks. That's a great question. Let me say that the studies that we looked at, the one that provides the most concrete detail suggests that we're looking at between 8 and 10 words over the course of a, let's say, 8 or 9 day unit, giving, say, 30 to 40 minutes a day for vocabulary work each day of that unit. So, you know, the time piece sort of depends on the amount of time, but what we don't want to do is go deep just in 1 or 2 days, potentially for the same amount of minutes, let's say, then do this over the course of several days to ensure that there are different modes and that there's some time between exposures and encounters to really sort of process and consolidate. So I can say that, you know, at a minimum, it would be probably 1 school week, but many of the current effective approaches straddle 2 school weeks and have probably somewhere in the ballpark of about 10 words.
Thank you. Patrick, we have a question for you. When pairing students heterogeneously, should teachers provide guidance on how to have productive discussions so that one student does not simply correct the other student's mistake or just give the answer?
Yes, that's a good question. Guidance is crucial. So what we're finding when we look at students' discussions is that kids don't just come to school and are able to have academic discussions around big topics. There's 2 dimensions. One is the importance of the discussion, but the other is exactly that there has to be, they need opportunities to practice. So it's not just talking, it's the structure in which talk is occurring. So, you know, the tenets, you know, we all adhere to the tenets of accountable talk, and listening to what students say is one of those. Listening to the idea rather than to the student or to the person is one key component of accountable talk, as are some very, you know, some what you might call sentence starters for sort of reasoned discourse amongst people. That is, I agree with what you're saying, but things of that nature, those don't come naturally. And so implicit in this notion that teachers ought to be using discussion-based approaches is also direct instruction around how to have a good discussion. And we see this developing over time with students. That they don't start there, but they are able to develop it with facilitation from their teachers.
Thank you, Patrick. We have another question for Noni. How would you align recommendation 1 with present strategies such as Siop?
I think that recommendation 1, thinking about the Siop model in particular, I think you could certainly work as part of the language objective on an academic, be focusing on academic words, and choose an academic word as part of the content objective also. So I don't see it as particular, I see it as sort of able to be integrated. Where I think we want to be really clear about the difference is that the target academic words under study don't live just within a lesson. So where the Siop tends to focus on a lesson and its characteristics, we want to remind ourselves we're looking to study these words over time.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, should teachers be setting aside specialized time in the day for writing, or should writing be infused over the course of the school day?
Yeah, I think inherent in the recommendation is that writing should become a regular part of the school day. And in fact, separating out explicit time just for writing, that is something that teachers can and in some cases should do. leave time for writing. But if that should not be the only format in which writing instruction is occurring, because what we want is for kids to understand that writing is a part of the content learning process. And so infusing that across the school day at multiple time points, at multiple sort of instructional leverage points is really the thrust of that recommendation.
Thank you, Noni and Patrick. We have reached the end of our question and answer period. I would now like to introduce Scott Baker, who will present on recommendation number 4.
Thank you very much. Next slide. So our 4th recommendation is to provide small group instructional interventions for English learners. These who are struggling particularly in the areas of literacy and English language development. So this recommendation is targeting a specific group of English learners. Next. The level of evidence here is moderate. There's a sizable number of studies. There are 6 randomized controlled trials that meet the standards. Most of them, 5 of the 6, focus on the primary grade, so kindergarten through grade 2. There was one study that focused on grades 6 through 8. The panel reviewed the studies and concluded that the information from them can be applied to kids throughout grades K through 8. And like the other recommendations with the corresponding studies, the results in these studies were either for English learners specifically or for a sample that included non-English learners, but the predominant population was English learners. The impact of the interventions was assessed on a range of language and reading measures, and the primary reason for the moderate rating has to do with the fact that there were a number of positive findings across these studies, but also some findings where the impact was not discernible. There were no negative findings, but there were some that were in the fairly close to 0 range in terms of an effect size. So the panel concluded that the level of evidence was moderate. Next. So in terms of the meaning of this for teachers and our elements and how-tos, we've got 5 for this recommendation, and I'm going to focus on the 4th and 5th steps in particular, but the first 3 kind of go together as a unit. So the main thing about this recommendation is we're targeting a subsample of English learners, those that have been determined to be struggling in areas of literacy and language. So our first step is really to figure out who those kids are. And here we're able to do this pretty well in the areas of literacy, where we have a number of screening instruments that can be used to identify kids that are struggling in what we term in the practice guide foundational skills. So those are things like phonological awareness, decoding, reading fluency. We don't have these kinds of screeners for more complex skills like vocabulary knowledge or comprehension, but we do have them, and there's lots of information from the first practice guide for literacy skills. And that's an important thing because the content, the second how-to is to design the content around what kids need. So instead of focusing just on foundational skills, which I think could be a tendency for this recommendation for kids who are struggling in literacy in particular, the panel really wanted to emphasize that even if kids have decoding problems, all of the kids who are in this group who are identified to be struggling in literacy or language areas should get vocabulary instruction and comprehension instruction as part of this small group experience. So the content really should be designed to meet their needs. And if they need instruction in foundational areas, and not all English language learners are going to need this, they should get it, but all English learners in this particular grouping structure should have time to work with words and the meaning of words and comprehension. We recommend small groups consist of 3 to 5 kids, So pretty small group sizes that mirrors the studies that are in this set of studies. So fairly small groups, and for the most part, if possible, teachers facilitating and directing those groups. The fourth step is to make sure that foundational skills are addressed if that's what the English learners need, but also to make sure that vocabulary development and reading and listening comprehension strategies are addressed. And then the last step, or how-to in this series, is to provide support, for teachers to provide support and scaffold and instruction that really provides a lot of practice and review for kids. So in contrast to introducing a lot of new material in this particular recommendation, the emphasis is really on solidifying what kids have been exposed to perhaps in an earlier part of the lesson, giving them a chance to really practice it and review it and apply it in multiple contexts across a number of different lessons. Next. So for the first three steps, those are fairly straightforward: identifying kids, designing intervention content, and grouping kids. In some cases, homogeneously. If the focus is on foundational skills, it seems to make more sense, perhaps, to group kids in a homogeneous way, where language and comprehension are really the focus. It can be very beneficial to group kids heterogeneously, so that kids who are less proficient in English, for example, have a chance to hear really good models of English being used, and where more proficient kids have an opportunity to explain and expand what they're learning about with language and vocabulary. But in all cases, our recommendation is that these small group experiences for kids should really target vocabulary development and comprehension strategies, both listening and reading comprehension. Next. So as you're probably getting a sense of today in listening to Noni and Patrick and now me in the fourth recommendation, one of the major themes in the practice guide is vocabulary acquisition and deep vocabulary instruction. And so in our fourth step here, we're introducing another type of vocabulary approach, one that can be embedded in the small group experience instructional formats for kids who are struggling, that's a little briefer, but still addresses many of the principles that we've been talking about today. There are lots of activities, actually, and there's a fairly strong focus on this in the practice guide. But in this particular case, we have Mr. Parker, who has grouped a small group of kids, 3 to 5, who are struggling to some degree with new vocabulary. And he provides this instruction in a fairly concentrated period of time, 10 to 15 minutes, and during that time includes a number of different vocabulary activities that can be helpful. Next. So in this particular example, the target word we're focusing on is instruction. And Mr. Parker introduces the word. He gives kids a chance to say the words themselves, and in this small group format with just a few kids, each kid could in turn have a chance to say the word so that they can pronounce it. He provides a student-friendly definition, which is another common theme, a definition that kids can really understand. And then he provides some examples using sentences to show kids kind of the range of use of this particular word. And then perhaps most importantly, kids have an opportunity to use the word and apply it. In this particular example, kids are going to use the target word in writing their own sentences in a journal. That's one activity. And then the second activity, perhaps a bit more complex, is to use the word in a graphic organizer activity where they complete an organizer that the teacher and the kids have worked on together to situate this particular target word. Next. And the fifth step is to provide scaffolded instruction so that kids get lots of opportunities to practice and review what they've learned previously or maybe have not learned completely in various contexts over several lessons. When they do this with the teacher in this case then can provide lots of feedback to kids, which can extend conversations, provide clarification about things that are correct or incorrect about answers to questions, so that the interaction between teachers and kids in this small group format can be pretty advanced. And if kids are practicing things that they know pretty well, kids will have lots of opportunities to talk and to explain their approaches and solutions to problems. Next. One of the most powerful tools that teachers can use in this kind of context is to provide really vivid demonstrations of what they're talking about when they are asking kids about vocabulary meanings or comprehension. In this particular case, we're talking about a comprehension activity that's an inferential comprehension activity where the teacher has read the students a very short excerpt about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. In this particular example, Rosa Parks has been asked to give up her seat to a white person on the bus, and she refuses and is fined. So the kids and the teacher read this text together, and the teacher introduces then an inferential question about the text. How would you describe Rosa Parks? It's a fairly simple question. We kind of like that, actually, that it's understandable, pretty straightforward. And in this context, because of the particular event, the Rosa Parks not giving up her seat on the bus, and the actual text that the teachers and kids read, it actually lends itself to a nice activity. And so in this particular case, the teacher is using a think aloud approach to demonstrate how she would come up with an answer of how you would describe Rosa Parks using the text. And so another kind of major theme that runs throughout the practice guide is this notion on situating activities and tasks and discussions around text. So again and again, we come back to the idea that text as an anchor for skill acquisition and discussions is really a good idea. And in this particular case, the teacher is providing a fairly vivid demonstration of how she would describe Rosa Parks by using the text itself. And there's lots of examples in here where the teacher is reminding kids and reinforcing for kids that the text itself says this, the author says a particular thing that goes on, that happens 2 or 3 times, and uses linking words to help make the connection between this is what the text says, and from that I can conclude that Rosa Parks is this type of person. So in going through that, the teacher vividly demonstrates that Rosa Parks was in her opinion, Rosa Parks was really brave, showed bravery and courage by staying in her seat, and knowing that there would be some kind of punishment or fine associated with that. She was also very calm. The text is pretty clear about that, where there wasn't any fighting going on or struggles, and she had to pay a fine, and that, as many of you know, was the sort of the impetus for a larger movement around the bus boycott. After that, the kids then can also pair up, or if the group is small enough, they can practice this activity with the teacher. They can do it in partners. They can take excerpts and use other scaffoldings like sentence starters or sentence frames to help get the conversation started. But the teacher has provided a really comprehensive sort of example of what, how you would take the text and answer a question about Rosa Parks from it. Next. So we have a couple of potential roadblocks that we thought might be an issue for folks. The first one is the notion of using kind of a one-size-fits-all approach for kids who are struggling. For English learners and non-English learners, and particularly in the early grades, who are having difficulty with literacy and or language, there can be a tendency to focus a lot on the foundational skills, and for many kids they're going to need that for sure. But not all kids necessarily need foundational skills. It may be that they need more comprehension instruction, or they may not know the meanings of words and have difficulty with comprehension because of that. So the instructional decisions and the content that's made for kids needs to really be based on what they need. There's actually pretty good evidence that with good foundational skill instruction, English learners can do as well as non-English learners. They can really master the code, as they say, pretty easily with the same kind of instruction that native English speakers get. Where there's difficulty, and this makes sense given that they are English learners, is because their language skills are emerging, they're going to have difficulty with vocabulary and, in some senses, comprehension. So, our recommendation again is that when kids are struggling with literacy and language skills, that there should be a strong focus, in addition to foundational skills that they may need, on vocabulary and comprehension. The second roadblock has to do with, in some ways, the location where this instruction might occur. There's a kind of a natural tendency to think that this might be the kind of instructional intervention that would go on in a Tier 2 context if you're using some sort of multi-tiered system. And we purposely in the guide don't suggest that this is a Tier 2 intervention. In fact, we think that a lot of these components, although how to use them in small group settings is going to be more challenging, but we think a lot of these components really need to be integrated really well within Tier 1. And so one idea is to think about the differentiated instructional component of Tier 1 during that last part of the day where you do try to provide some small group instruction for kids during that differentiated part, to think about some of that time. May not be the 30-minute kind of block that you might typically use for Tier 2, might be shorter than that, but to use that time for some of the small group instructional experiences that are part of recommendation 4. That's not to say that Tier 2 might also be a venue for this kind of instruction for kids, but it doesn't have to be situated just in a Tier 2 kind of context. And the degree to which Tier 1 incorporates these instructional strategies and principles in a kind of fully integrated way, including differentiated instruction, it will have the tendency of reducing the number of kids who may need the kind of Tier 2 support that many kids are going to need, especially in the early grades. Next. Oh, and now we can take your questions.
Thank you, Scott. At this time, we will be asking Scott, Noni, and Patrick the questions you send in. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the box under the word questions and hit send. Scott, the first question we have is for you. Approximately how long should the class or grouping last in terms of time or length?
We give some recommendations in the practice guide, but we don't have hard and fast rules. Typically, as I was just talking about, in tier 1, there's a differentiated instruction part. Sometimes it's 15 minutes, sometimes 10, sometimes 20. That part of tier 1 could be used for the small group instruction that is part of recommendation 4. In general, the more time kids can get in small group instruction, the better. It's actually it's part of the other recommendations as well as part of recommendations 1, 2, and 3. If kids can work in small groups and to the greatest degree possible also with teacher supervision, instruction, guidance, facilitation, that tends to be very helpful. We know that it's more costly to do that because the grouping size for recommendation 4 is pretty small, 3 to 5 kids, so we know that time is of a premium. But we think during that differentiated instruction part, some of that time can be used. And then for tier 2, the typical recommendations are 30 to 40 minutes of a tier 2 experience for kids who are needing a tier 2 intervention.
Thank you, Scott. Noni, the next question is for you. What are the best ways to assess students' deep understanding of the vocabulary, and how will we know that they get multiple meanings of each word?
So that's a great question. Of course, we can all think of formative assessments that might, we could even imagine sort of straightforward. In our case, in some of our own developmental, intervention research, we've developed, multiple choice kinds of assessments. But that wouldn't, of course, be the gold standard. What we really might want to do is really look at their word usage in context. So we can all imagine a written assignment with a prompt and the request to use some of the academic words. We can all imagine looking at that word usage in the written context. We can also imagine, of course, observing it in the oral context in a discussion or a debate and that kind of thing. So, on the one hand, there are reasons maybe to develop short assessments for the whole class to kind of capture some of that information across students, but a lot of this is going to be about good formative assessment that really looks and observes deeply, closely rather, at students' word usage. We've had the best luck with our written assignments giving us a real window, students' production, writing production, giving us a real window into their vocabulary knowledge.
Thank you, Noni. Scott, the next question we have is for you. Should EL students be separated for Tier 2 support, or if so, what should they miss from the general classroom? We have about 2 minutes left, Scott, for you to answer that question.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. And another concept that gets at this a little bit is the idea of using small group time to have English learners and non-English learners. And so one of the maybe a guiding principle is that if you're dealing with foundational skills where you may have English learners and non-English learners on par, there may be kids who are dealing with difficulty with the code, for example, decoding, or maybe with reading fluency. Homogeneously grouping those kids, but mixing English learners and non-English learners is a good thing to do. And then in terms of language development, as kids start using language to explain content that they're reading, to answer comprehension questions, also finding ways to integrate English learners and non-English learners into those small group experiences, as Patrick was mentioning before. Providing small group instruction or writing instruction throughout the day is sort of a theme here as well. Breaking kids up regularly so that they have the opportunity to use language is a good idea. And in language use and production, doing that in ways that are where heterogeneous groups can be used is also a good guiding principle.
Thank you, Scott. We have reached the end of our question and answer period. I would now like to introduce Russell Gersten, who was the project director for this updated guide.
Hi. As I'm sure you heard and could discern, this was a wonderful panel to work with. I think one element of the panel, I mean, as you heard, these are 3 individuals actively engaged in research in classrooms and schools, and it showed in a range of examples. All they could do is skim the surface in the hour or so we had today, but I want to encourage you to download this practice guide, browse through some of the others, and possibly use them for professional learning community activities you may have at your school or district, or any related study group kind of thing. And one thing that was implicit, but I'm sure many of you sense that these suggestions are very linked to the Common Core and to some of these issues about academic language and vocabulary that are stressed there. And so I want to thank you for attending and thank the presenters.
Thank you for attending the webinar on the newest WWC Practice Guide on Teaching English Learners. The webinar has now ended. A recording of this presentation will be available on the IES website.